This week on Sources, we focus on the ongoing efforts to advance human rights and inclusion for LGBTQ plus people in Guyana. Founded in 2003, the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, SASOD, has become a leading voice in the fight against discrimination, stigma, and inequality. From grassroots education to regional advocacy, SASOD has worked for over 2 decades to shift public attitudes, influence policy, and support those at risk of exclusion and violence. Now, with the launch of its LGBTQIA Manifesto, the organization is calling for bold legislative and constitutional reforms aimed at protecting LGBTQ Guyanese through equal rights under the law, inclusive education, and justice-centered public services. Joining us today is Joel Simpson, the Managing Director of SASOD, who will discuss the progress made, the challenges that remain, and the path forward for building a more inclusive society for all. Welcome to Sources. I'm your host, Svetlana Marshall. This week, we'll be talking about SASOD, the work SASOD has been doing since its formation in 2003. And to do so with me, I have the Managing Director of SASOD, Mr. Joel Simpson. Mr. Simpson, thank you so much for joining me on Sources.
Thank you for having me, Svetlana.
22 years, a long time.
Yeah.
What would you say are some of your major achievements, your success stories since the launch of SASOD some 22 years ago?
Yeah, we launched, I would say, on June 7th, 2003. And it's been a long journey. Over the past more than 2 decades, we've had a number of achievements, although I think there's still a lot to be done. I think we're proud of some of the achievements that we've had to date. I think top among those is we've been able to strike down the laws against cross-dressing. Cross-dressing was decriminalized. Guyana was the last country in the entire America's hemisphere and probably the last in the world in terms of secular law to have offenses against cross-dressing on the books. We know that these exist in Sharia law in Muslim countries. And when we started, we became aware of the law first in 2006, 3 years after we'd started, when there was a single arrest. And then by 2009, over a 48-hour period, there were a number of crackdowns. And we spent a long time in court going through all 3 levels of court in Guyana, all the way to the Caribbean Court of Justice in November 2018, when we got a successful decision which declared that the then laws against cross-dressing were unconstitutional, and the court struck them down, so they were no longer on the books. And I think we're most proud of that achievement because we have a major focus on legislative change, because we believe that legal change will sustain any of the gains that we make at the social level. Whatever we change in terms of people being more accepting, more tolerant, the way to sustain that is to have those protections enshrined in law. And then I would say another major success for us, particularly in our what we call our homophobia education program, which is about changing hearts and minds about how people view LGBTQIA people, is our Pride Festival. We started celebrating Pride as a festival in Guyana in 2017, June 2017, but in June 2018, we became the first country in the English-speaking Caribbean to host a public Pride parade. And shortly after that, there were Pride parades about a month after in Trinidad and Tobago, and then maybe a couple of weeks after in Barbados. So we were very proud to be the first to have a parade in the English-speaking Caribbean. And our festival continued virtually throughout the pandemic, and we continue to sustain our Pride Festival, which we just celebrated last month here in Guyana. And then I think another major success and this one is related to our third program that we have, we call our Human Services Program. We spent about 5 years between 2016 to 2020 advocating for pre-exposure prophylaxis, or very simply the HIV prevention pill, to be made available in the public health system for anybody who wants to access it. And when the PPP administration took office in August of 2020, by the end of the year, there was a new HIV policy which was launched in December. And and in that policy, the government committed to making PrEP available in the public health system for those at risk of HIV and who want to use PrEP. And that became a reality in 2021. And we're very proud of that achievement as well.
Okay. Now, the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, SASOD, over the years would have conducted numerous studies, surveys, and published several reports as well. And in 2018, a report titled TRAP spoke about the cycle of violence and discrimination among members of the community. Do you see that report? Is it the situation still the same in 2025, or there has been progress?
I think there has been progress in the area of social attitudes. That has certainly improved. And we see results to that effect in our 2022 poll, which we launched in November 2022. And that was only the second ever poll done on attitudes towards LGBTQ people in Guyana. The first poll was done in 2013. And the 2022 poll was able to compare the situation 9 years later. And in that, we saw, for instance, that hatred of LGBTQ people went down from 25% to 12%, a 50% reduction, which I think is significant. When you look at tolerance and acceptance, which we basically split up attitudes into 3 areas, acceptance, tolerance, and hatred. When you look at tolerance and acceptance, there was over 30% improvement in those 2 combined categories over the 9-year period, particularly with a significant increase in acceptance. So I think attitudes have improved significantly. Now, does that mean there's no longer discrimination, there's no longer violence? Of course not. I think we still lack important protections to be able to sanction violence. For instance, in Guyana, we don't have any legislation against hate crimes, against anybody, not just LGBTQ people. And hate crimes happen in this country on all kinds of different grounds: race, ethnicity, religion, sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. We don't have specific legislation to punish that. So there are hate crimes from time to time. We still have maybe about 12% of the population who would describe themselves as hating LGBT people. And hate is a very strong emotion that could obviously lead to hate crimes as well. So the situation is not perfect, but I think we've come a long way since the 2018 report. I'm also mindful of as well that the 2018 report was pre-pandemic, and the country and the world went through a whole COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw violence and intolerance manifest itself in different ways, particularly during the pandemic because we weren't having as much in-person interaction. We noticed cyberbullying on the rise. That was a place where people were maybe acting out their discriminatory attitudes. So it's a mixed bag, but I think there's been significant progress.
Okay. And so to have greater tolerance, greater acceptance of LGBTQ plus individuals, SASOD in 2023 would have launched the Guyana Together campaign, sharing stories of persons of LGBTQ plus persons. How successful that campaign has been. It's now 2 years in.
I think it's been a great success and we'll be able soon to be able to do a study that will actually measure that. But we probably need to put in another couple of years' work before we invest in that kind of study. First of all, we we took an opportunity during the pandemic when the world slowed down a bit to take stock of the work that we've done for the last 2 decades. And we wanted to try a new approach. What we found when we look back at our work, that like you said, we've done a lot of studies, published them in academic journals as well, publicly available, launched them in the media. What we found is that we've done a lot of work to document the kind of discrimination and violence that takes place in Guyana. And there's no doubt anymore. When we first started this work in 2003, we were told by the politicians and the policymakers that we didn't have any evidence of discrimination and violence. So we made a concerted effort over nearly 2 decades to provide that evidence. And then we found we got to a stage where nobody could deny that discrimination is a reality for LGBTQIA people in the country. But using that evidence base to change hearts and minds was yielding, I think, limited results, because stories of victimhood would generate a kind of temporary empathy. So people would listen to the stories and be like, yeah, you shouldn't hit people or hurt people, but generally kind of move on with their lives. It wasn't a call to action, an individual call to action, so to say. So what we realized is we needed to go beyond that, and this is what the Guyana Together campaign does, and not only talk about violence, discrimination, and human rights violations that affect sexual and gender minorities, but also show allies and show how allies are doing their part to create change. And so we wanted to have a more positive dimension of the story, and hence the big difference in the Guyana Together campaign from anything that we've done over the last 2+ decades is that it focuses on allies telling the story about why they're allies. So Guyana Together is about, I'm a mother, and this is why I accept my lesbian daughter. I'm a father, this is why I accept my transgender child. I'm an employer, I'm a faith leader. So we tell the story through the voices of allies. And the reason for that is that we want to inspire ordinary Guyanese who are looking at these stories to see how they can become allies and how they can contribute to that change. And we think showing them examples of what other people are doing is a great way to inspire that. And so far, we've been having amazing results. We're just celebrating just over 100 endorsers endorsing the campaign, and these are Guyanese businesses and organizations. Individuals can take a pledge on the GuyanaTogether.gy website, but we've been working as well with different chamber groups. The campaign is founded by the Guyana Press Association, the Black Entrepreneurs Association, and the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, alongside SASOD Guyana. And we've done a number of events with other supporting partners who have now come on board. And now we have the Tourism and Hospitality Association of Guyana. We held an event with them last year, September, for World Tourism Day. We have the Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We held an event with them around Women's Day. We had a side event at their Women and Girls Summit in March of this year. We've worked with the Rotary Club of Georgetown, and we've had 2 events with them in 2024, in January and in December. And we're trying to work now, post-elections, we'll be looking to do a lot more work with trade unions and bilateral chambers in particular.
Okay, now I want to talk a bit about health and LGBTQ people. As a health reporter, I've heard the ministry in particular speak about high-risk populations, and oftentimes LGBTQ persons fall within that bracket. What work you've been doing through SASOD to educate members of the community on how to better protect themselves and guard against such diseases?
Right, in particular, the 2 groups that, in Guyana in particular, there are like 3 groups that are, for want of a better term, priority populations, or they call them key populations in public health. And those are men who have sex with men, transgender people, trans women in particular, and sex workers of all genders. Particularly for men who have sex with men and trans women, it would be because of the type of sexual activity that they would engage in, being anal sex. But there are also other issues around those particular populations. One, the fact that their behavior is criminalized. It often happens underground. There's stigma related to these populations, so they don't come forward easily for testing. And if they're not tested, you can't get the ones who are positive on treatment. And of course, if you get people on treatment and they become undetectable, then there's no chance of them spreading HIV. So treatment is prevention in that way. So that's very important. For us, we have been focused particularly on trying to eradicate the stigma and discrimination that exists not only within the society, but we've had a huge focus on the health sector. And over the years, we've done extensive training with healthcare workers, and we have championed some training programs on gender and sexual diversity, which we've done across the health sector. We've worked at the national level with the Ministry of Health. We've also worked with some of the RDCs, particularly RDC Region 4. And we even piloted a health center on the East Bank as an LGBTQ-friendly health center in late 2019, and there was a plan to go on, and we still want to do more of that. So we've been working particularly to make health services more accessible, so there's far less discrimination. I think a study would need to be done to confirm this perception, but based on the fact, I think, that we're getting less reports, because one of the things that we do at SASOD is collect reports of human rights violations and so on. We're getting less reports which feature the health sector. So I think that's a good sign. I'm not saying we're not getting any, but we're getting far less in terms of the number of reports. Also, I think, too, there's greater political will, particularly in the health sector, once a report is made, to deal with it promptly, investigate, and to see what kind of redress can be provided. So we've seen some fruit borne there. In the past, we've also ourselves done HIV testing, provided commodities, and we've seen a significant reduction in the prevalence in these key populations. And I think it's because not just us alone, a lot of organizations focused on working on HIV have done a lot of work in that area. And this is also why we advocated so strongly for pre-exposure prophylaxis to be made available, because we think this is a game changer. If you know you're at high risk, you can take this medication like you take a multivitamin in a preventative way to avoid getting HIV. Where I think the gaps are, and this lies squarely at the feet of the National AIDS Program Secretariat in the Ministry of Health, there hasn't been enough promotion and marketing of PrEP. And it can't be on us just as a small NGO, a small under-resourced NGO. We don't get anything from the national budget to be responsible for marketing this medication to an entire country or to an entire population. The government has a responsibility there to play their part in making sure everybody knows about it. We are currently working on developing a campaign that will roll out in a small way on social media in the next few months. And every chance we get and every resource we have, we take the opportunity to promote and market it. I think we are, in our lifetimes, in sight of seeing an end to HIV if we can get all the available means, PrEP, testing, accessible. Everybody must know about it. There must be no stigma going and ask for an HIV test, going to a clinic to get PrEP. There's still a lot of stigma. A lot of our members still contact us and say, hey, which health center should I go to? Which one is more discreet? Which one is more friendly? This is where I live. Can you set up an appointment for me? And that just speaks to the fact that things are just not perfect just yet. Because if there was no stigma, there would be a reputation that you could go into any public hospital, any public site that has the service, and it would just be accessible to you. But we're not quite there yet.
Now, as an organization that champions the rights of LGBTQ plus individuals, have you been able to sit down with government officials, with the government over the past 22 years To say these are our plans, these are the issues confronting persons within our community, the human rights violations. And did you get a favorable response, if a response at all?
It has been we've been increasingly been able to access government, and we always work in a bipartisan way because we would like to see legislative change embraced by both sides of the political divide, so to speak, government and opposition. It's been increasingly easier to be able to talk to policymakers about our issues, and we've sat down a number of times, and I'm sure if you've seen and covered in the media, a number of engagements with key ministries. Our disappointment has been the lack of action, the lack of follow-up on these issues. And I will give a pointed example. We started, for instance, advocating for the Prevention of Discrimination Act 1997 to be amended since about 2015. And we even got to the point where we drafted the amendment ourselves with the support of the United Nations Development Program in Guyana. There were 2 rounds of consultancies. The UNDP hired an international consultant to work with us, and then they hired a Guyanese consultant, attorney at law Cassandra Alves, to work with us on refining a bill. So we have a bill. We submitted it to both administrations. Even up to the end of last year, I was promised that we would see that draft legislation reaching Parliament at the beginning of 2024. I was promised by the end of 2024 that that legislation would be before the National Assembly. And to date, here we are now, about to go into elections. Parliament has been prorogued, and no legislation has even been circulated for us to see what version thereof a government might be considering. So meeting and engaging is one thing, but if there is no follow-up, if there's no real commitment, if there's no real action, then it defeats the purpose. We try to do as much as we can as an organization, and that's why in the instance with that bill, we provided a draft ourselves. But it will then be for the government to take a look at it and see if this is what meets the criteria that they're looking for and so forth, if they want to make any tweaks to it, and then take it to the National Assembly. We can't take a bill to the National Assembly directly ourselves.
Now, in 2020, SASOD launched its first manifesto. You've since launched a second manifesto ahead of the September 1 general and regional elections. Tell me a bit about the manifesto. What are some of the demands, if I could use that word?
Yeah, so our manifesto is a 10-point priority document of the issues which directly affect LGBTQIA people that we want to see addressed by the new government, 2025 to 2030. We have prioritized the list, and as an organization really invested in human rights, sexual rights in particular, and gender justice, legal change is a top priority for us, because while public education and raising awareness will always be an ongoing need, for us, legal change is what will sustain those gains. So we've asked for, within the first year in office, that the new government within the first year in office should repeal sections 351 to 353 of the Criminal Law Offences Act, which criminalize forms of intimacy between adult men in private. And as you know, that's been the focus of the Guyana Together campaign since we've launched it in September 2023 to now. In this first phase of Guyana Together campaign, we've focused on decriminalizing same-sex intimacy, because this is the last law that is directly on the books which is discriminatory directly towards LGBTQ people. And we think it's really important to remove that bad law so that there's no room for extortion and bribes by the police. This has decreased significantly since we started doing police training directly with the Guyana Police Force since 2019, but it hasn't stopped completely. And the issue has been if the police see two men in a secluded area, maybe late at night in a public place, they might say, oh, what are you doing here? Oh, do you know it's illegal for two men to be intimate in Guyana? We're going to take you down to the station and charge you. Now, the reality is, it doesn't really make any sense because they would need to give evidence against each other. And if it's consensual, that will not happen. But because of the stigma attached to homosexuality, nobody wants to be taken to a police station and questioned about anything to do with that. So oftentimes we have documented reports of persons who've been forced to pay bribes. In one instance, we even have a former board member of our organization said to the police, well, I don't have any money on me. And they're like, okay, well, you can drive to the nearest ATM. And yeah, it was that bad. So the two young men were on the seawalls. They drive to the nearest ATM in Carmichael Street and to get money out to bribe the police in order to avoid being taken down to Brick Dam police station or wherever. That happened a few years ago. And we're saying once you leave the laws on the books, even if it hasn't happened for 2025, I haven't heard any reports for the year. If you leave the law on the books, you leave room for that kind of extortion and bribery to take place. So it's very important for us that a bad law is removed instantly, right? Like, why is that there? And we would like to see, as well, the UN Human Rights Committee, the UN Human Rights Council's recommended when Guyana went through its universal periodic review for the last few cycles. And we recently went through the review by the Human Rights Committee under the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. They said very, very clearly that, one, Guyana has no legislative protection for sexual and gender minorities. And the only legislation we have that really protects, ordinary legislation that protects people from discrimination, is the Prevention of Discrimination Act 1997. It is limited in that it only deals with the right to work, but it's an important socioeconomic right. Because if you face discrimination in relation to the right to work, it affects a lot of your other socioeconomic rights. It then affects your right to food, housing, and all these other material things because you work to get money to be able to take care of your needs. So we saw the importance of dealing with work-related discrimination, and that's why we've been advocating for that existing legislation to be amended, just to add 3 protected categories: sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So we see that as being very important. And the other thing that we recognized for a while, and the UN pointed out as well when we went through our human rights review processes as a country, is Guyana doesn't have any broad, comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation that protects people from discrimination in terms of all of their human rights, regardless of the sector. The only thing we have is this Prevention of Discrimination Act, 1997, and like I said, it's only related to the right to work. So we need new legislation, and this won't be anything LGBT specific, but we want it to be broad, comprehensive, and inclusive, and also include sexual orientation and gender identity, so nobody faces discrimination in terms of health, accessing social services, housing, whatever the specific human right is, people would have protection. And I think that's important because even though you might change attitudes, sometimes a lot of that is cyclical. There could be ebbs and flows, and the government isn't taking its responsibility to do human rights education. So we're pulling a lot of this burden as civil society, trying to educate people. And we might not always have the resources to do it at optimum as well as we're doing it right now. So what is going to be the safeguard is when any human rights violation takes place, hate crime, discrimination, people must have some legal recourse. People must be able to go to the police and say it's against ABC law. They must be able to bring a civil suit and say, you violated my rights, you know. They must be able to say, well, our Constitution now has sexual orientation and gender identity as grounds for discrimination in the non-discrimination provision. It doesn't at the moment. So, they can bring a constitutional suit. There must be recourse. And when people are able to get that kind of recourse, and perpetrators are sanctioned by bodies like the courts, it serves as a deterrent. Anybody thinking about committing a human rights violation will think twice about doing it.
What about inclusion at the level of the education system?
That has been a slow and vexing issue. We, over the years, and you might have, I'm sure as a journalist, you see media reports from time to time, this issue of anti-LGBTQ bullying in schools. Sometimes when the incidents get very, very violent, you see the media reports on it. We have even seen within the last 5 years, teachers being targeted. So it hasn't been students alone. And it could be real or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. Sometimes it's just a perception, but it doesn't change the reality. We've seen situations where teachers are attacked by parents and guardians on the basis of sexual orientation. We've seen protests. The teachers' union have had to stage protests outside the schools because of these issues and that kind of thing. So we've been advocating for a long time, definitely over 10 years, for the existing education policy. There's a non-discrimination clause in it, obviously written a long time ago, even before we started raising these issues, to have that amended to include sexual orientation and gender identity as a starting point. And I think one of the things that we ask for in our manifesto is for us to deal with this issue of bullying and violence in this education system at the policy level. And we would like to see something at the policy level that says, bullying and violence on the basis of sexuality and gender is totally wrong. In addition to that, the education system, the Ministry of Education, who would be the government department responsible for this, will ensure that teachers are trained at the level of the Cyril Potter College of Education, which is the only national teachers training college in the country, and at least at the level of the National University, the University of Guyana, that they will ensure that there are courses in there which sensitize teachers about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we don't have any of these kinds of bias and prejudice in the school system, at least coming from the teachers and the school administrators. And I think while we're talking about anti-LGBTQ bullying, we would want these policies to be broad-based and inclusive and cover all prejudices. So it's about racism, it's about xenophobia, misogyny, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all the whole gamut of prejudice and discrimination. Have teachers trained, sensitized, so they're not the perpetrators of it in the first instance. In the second instance, when it does happen in the school environment, at least they know how to deal with it. And there should be mechanisms within the school system for dealing with it. Because what we found, that's led to particularly those students who are the victims of that kind of bullying, either dropping out of school or underperforming. And in this 21st century world, if you don't have any kind of academic qualification, a secondary education is so very important. We live in a very, very paper-based qualification world. It's very difficult for you to go on. So while you see a higher number of particularly trans people involved in sex work, considering there's such a small minority of people, is a direct relation to transphobic discrimination, which starts very, very early. And a lot of the trans people that we work with were dropped out of school because of transphobic bullying. So we're like, the only way to change this and for us to see better educational outcomes for our communities is that we need to bring an end to this bullying in all forms in the education system generally.
Okay. Now that you've launched your manifesto, how do you get the message across to the political parties? According to GCOM, there are more than 20 political parties contesting the upcoming elections. Do you send copies of the manifesto to the parties? Do you sit down with them to discuss, the demands?
Multiple ways. One, I think GCOM is a starting point for us, and we are in the process of engaging GCOM to strengthen its code of conduct for the elections. For the last couple of election cycles, the code of conduct that GCOM has includes sexual orientation as grounds for discrimination and says very clearly that candidates should not be saying anything discriminatory on the basis of race, ethnicity, and they list sexual orientation. We want to strengthen that to include gender identity because we have been seeing increasingly it's been transphobic rhetoric coming out from the politicians, and we're starting to see it already on social media, and this is on all sides. One of the things that we do is we document and track all of this. Anything we hear politicians say, anything we see on social media, we have a whole database where we're tracking all of this. And at some point, we're going to release some analysis about this. So GCOM is an important starting point for us because at least there's a code of conduct to which people opt in, they sign on, and we can hold them accountable to that. The other way that we get this, we definitely will send it out, but we're not going to take chances that people will read those 3 pages, those 10 demands and 3 pages. In the last week of July, we did this in 2020, but now we're doing it with way ahead of the election compared to then. We are holding our second ever LGBTQIA elections town hall. In 2020, we did this exactly a week before elections. We had elections on March 2nd. We had the town hall the day after Mashramani, because I remember Mash was a Sunday, and the town hall was on Monday, February 24th or something like that. So we found that it was too close to the election to have the impact that we wanted to have. But even then, in 2020, we had 7 of the 11 parties that contested the election participated in the town hall. And those 7 parties are the ones that ended up, in some shape or form, represented in Parliament, 3 through a joinder list system, a joinder seat, if you might want to call it. So we're hosting that again, but we're doing it now. It's going to be over a month before the election. We have it slated for the last week of July. And we're going to invite all the parties that actually make it to the ballot. So that's why it was important to wait until after nomination day to see who's really on the ballot. And I think that is an important discussion. What we saw in 2020 is a number of the parties. We had 15 priorities then. This time around we have 10. A number of the parties incorporated our priorities and said, hey, even though it was just a week, well, we had launched a manifesto before, but a number of them had incorporated our demands and said, hey, we saw your manifesto in the media, we saw it on your blog, your website. These are the things that we agree with, and we've included them in our manifesto. And when they came to the town hall, they were able to share, this is what we committed to based on the manifesto. So that's another way that we engage around the manifesto and get some commitments. We think that's really important because once the parties put that in writing, they make it to Parliament, whichever side they make it on, then we have something to hold you accountable to because you promised that you would do this. I think the other important lesson that we learned from 2020, when we first did this is only our second time around, and we have the benefit of hindsight, 2020 vision. We have now scaled the 10 priorities and we've timelined them and said, okay, this is what we want to see in year 1. We didn't say we want to see these 15 things happen in 5 years. Now it's 10 things we want to see happen in 4 years, because basically the last year is going to be focused on elections. And we want to see, I always remember the legislative ones, we want to see decriminalization of same-sex intimacy happen in year 1. We want to see the Prevention of Discrimination Act 1997 amended to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. We want to see that happen by the end of year 2. By the end of year 3, we want to see broad, comprehensive legislation which deals with all forms of discrimination, not just sexual orientation, gender identity, all forms of discrimination and all sectors. So everybody's protected. We want to see that happen by the end of year 3. And certainly by the end of year 4, we know that this current administration has set up a Constitutional Reform Commission. They didn't seem to get to do anything in this current term. Assuming that commission will continue or another one will be formed, we want to see the anti-discrimination provision amended to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's where we started in 2003 when we first started as SASOD. It was really in response to the Parliament between 2001 and then in 2003 discussing whether to include sexual orientation as grounds for discrimination in the Constitution. It didn't make it in there in the end, but now we've also expanded our constitutional acts to include gender identity to ensure transgender people in particular receive protection.
How could LGBTQ persons put greater pressure, in addition to what SASOD is doing, the town hall meetings, the manifesto, but how could they hold government accountable? Oftentimes, the parties go to various communities, various organizations, and they ask for support. Do you think as a constituent, say, the LGBTQ community could put greater pressure to have their demands met?
Definitely. And one of the things that we're also doing this month, more quietly behind the scenes, is training community members to engage around elections. So we're not just taking this kind of top-up approach of engaging, as advocates with government and parliamentarians and so on, but we're also training the community about how to engage and how to become more politically involved. That's just basically being a better citizen, like being informed about policies and positions, engaging the parties, and also, very importantly, not just for the community or communities alone, but our families, our friends, our allies, is using your vote to create change. Look and see, as we do this work throughout July, which political parties are making genuine commitments towards these priorities. Some of them will say they're doing it and probably have no intention of doing it. But look to see where you think there are genuine commitments towards these priorities, and use your vote as well. And this is not just about LGBTQ people alone. We have families. Our allyship is broad. And with the increasing acceptance and respect that we're seeing in our poll, for us, the constituency is not just our communities itself, but all the allies. So our families, our friends, our co-workers, the people that we go to church, temple, and mosque with, all of those people, we're saying to our communities of support, this is an important electoral issue as well, and use your vote accordingly.
Would you want to see, at least on the list, nomination day has come and gone, but would you want to see a LGBTQ representative in Parliament?
Definitely. I know, of course, I think we've had representatives before, but have people openly address that identity. And I know that there's some young advocates who are listed on many of the parties' lists, who are openly gay and queer, and we'd love to see not just for the the significance or the symbolism of it alone, but we would like to see somebody or persons who are qualified, who understand the issues, and people who are accountable as well to our communities and also to the parties, provide some representation in Parliament. I think that would be a huge win for everybody.
Earlier you spoke about organizations that would have supported your campaigns and programs throughout the years. You mentioned the Georgetown Chamber, the Press Association, some of the Rights Commission, some of the ministries. But who are some of the other major backers? Who are some of the organizations that have stood with SASOD over the past 2 decades?
Oh wow, so many. I mentioned a couple already. The sector that comes to mind in a very, very strong way has always been private sector. I can remember as far back as 2013 when now Dr. Clinton Erling was president of the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry, when we first started doing sensitization fora with the Georgetown Chamber, sometimes all day looking at these issues and so on. And they have been a long-time ally. And that, I think, and they're the oldest chamber in the country, and I think the second oldest or maybe the oldest in the Caribbean, but certainly been around for a long time, since 18-something. And with the newer chambers that have come along, because of that good precedent, I think that has allowed us to easily gain partnerships with some of the newer chambers that come along. We were involved in the Black Entrepreneurs Association as well. SASOD itself is now a member of the Tourism and Hospitality Association of Guyana. We just became a member on the 1st of July. We are a partner and engaging with the Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry as well. And then we post-elections, I think you can look forward to seeing more work with the bilateral chambers, because there are a number of bilateral chambers in Guyana now. So I think private sector has been a very, very strong group. Another one that you don't hear about us working with so much, but for them, being allies are pretty much a no-brainer type of issue, is the trade unions. We've had a very, very good, great support over the years of working with trade unions, and they say very, very clearly that labor rights is part of human rights. LGBTQ rights is human rights. So it's a no-brainer for us. You have our support for decriminalization, amending all the legislation to protect people from discrimination, because this will also benefit the workplace and benefit the workforce, because if people are protected, they're going to be more productive at work, right? So I think the labor unions has been another very strong sector. And then I think I would say civil society generally. Since May 2011 in particular, we started what's called the Guyana Equality Forum, which is a network of civil society organizations, and SASOD Guyana is the secretariat of it. So we're like the administrative hub. And it includes over 20-something organizations who are working on human rights and equality in the country, and it includes groups working on women's rights, men's issues, sex workers, HIV, child rights, indigenous people's rights, you name it. A very broad-based human rights network. And I think it's the only one that has managed to sustain itself and keep active for so long, including without any kind of direct funding. Those civil society organizations and just civil society in Guyana across the board have been like huge partners and the strongest allies. I remember sometimes when we have issues like cross-dressing, the cross-dressing case was still in court, and one particular magistrate was refusing to allow a trans person in court in women's clothes, and we staged protests. It was the women's rights groups that came out in numbers and supported us and so on. So civil society, I think, has been another kind of strong partner for us.
Joel, closing remarks as we wrap up.
Closing remarks, what can I say? I guess I can ask the public to, as well, like we're asking all our allies to be engaged this election season and to particularly look at LGBTQIA issues as an important election issue. Ask the questions of your political leaders, especially the ones that you're inclined to support, and look to see if you're getting genuine answers about these issues which are important to our communities and also important to you, and to use your vote accordingly. I mean, none of us vote on a single issue, but I'm asking the public to make this an important issue, a priority issue that you consider, that you factor into your decision making when you're about to cast your ballot on September 1st.
Joel, all the best with your town hall meeting and the manifesto and engaging the political parties. I look forward to attending the town hall meeting and providing coverage. So I wish you all the best, and with your future plans to SASOD. And congratulations, 22 years is a long time to be in business, and you're going strong as the managing director of that organization. And with that, we've come to the end of this edition of Sources. I've been your host, Svetlana Marshall. Thanks for watching.